Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Territory of Cinema channel. If you are new here, please consider hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a like if you enjoy our content. Today we are going to be discussing the 2016 film I Am Wrath. The opening moments introduce us to John Connor, a seemingly ordinary man whose life is shattered by a brutal act of violence. We see him as a dedicated husband, clearly deeply in love with his wife, living a quiet, respectable existence. His past, however, hints at a history steeped in intense physical training and discipline, perhaps a former military background, which is subtly emphasized by his almost instinctual reactions in moments of sudden danger. This duality between the gentle family man and the capable operative forms the core tension of his character. The catalyst for everything that follows is the senseless murder of his wife during a robbery gone wrong. The film paints a stark picture of the American justice system failing him. The perpetrators walk free due to technicalities or insufficient evidence, an outcome that shatters John's faith in the very institutions he once respected. It is here, amidst the wreckage of his personal life and his belief in the rule of law, that the transformation begins. We follow John as he quietly prepares himself. Drawing on latent skills, perhaps from his undisclosed military career, which specialized in close-quarters combat or perhaps covert operations, he begins a methodical quest for retribution. This isn't a sudden fit of rage, it's a calculated, almost philosophical undertaking driven by the notion that if the system cannot deliver justice, an individual must become the agent of that justice. Think of those old Western tropes, but updated with modern urban grit. His path soon crosses with a network of shadowy figures, suggesting that the people who killed his wife were not random thugs, but connected to something larger. We see glimpses of gang activity, perhaps involving corrupt elements within the city structure, giving his personal vendetta a wider scope. John becomes a ghost, moving through the underbelly of the city, striking swiftly and leaving behind a trail of very surprised criminals. His methods are efficient, brutal, and often leave no witnesses who can testify against him. The local police, led by a detective who is clearly torn between his duty to uphold the law and a growing, albeit unspoken, sympathy for John's cause, find themselves chasing a phantom. The detective recognizes the pattern of violence but also the specificity of the targets, all connected to the initial crime. This pursuit adds a layer of ethical complexity, forcing the viewer to question the line between vigilante justice and true law enforcement. As John closes in on the main players, the narrative reveals the network's leader, likely a figure of significant local influence, someone untouchable by normal means. The film builds towards a final confrontation where John must use every ounce of his trained capability. This isn't about showmanship, it's about survival and completion of his self-appointed mission. The final sequences are intense, showcasing his relentless focus, a man who has nothing left to lose. He achieves his goal, not out of victory, but out of necessity, a terrible personal closure born from unforgivable loss, leaving the audience to ponder the cost of his necessary rage. The narrative skillfully establishes John's prior life as a stark contrast to the violence that engulfs him. We sense, through his unwavering posture and almost unsettling calm when facing the initial shock, the echoes of a rigorous, disciplined existence. Perhaps he was a special forces operator, someone trained to operate under immense duress, where maintaining emotional equilibrium was paramount to mission success. This ingrained training is what surfaces when the legal system fails. It's not the anger of an ordinary man, it's the frustration of a highly capable instrument rendered useless by bureaucracy. His grief isn't loud, it's a corrosive silence that reshapes his identity. When John begins his crusade, the execution is precise, lacking the wild abandon one might expect from a man seeking simple revenge. He operates with the methodical patience of someone used to long surveillance or infiltration. One can imagine his past involving missions where collateral damage was unacceptable, translating now into a strict targeting protocol against those involved in his wife's death and the subsequent cover-up. He targets the middle management of the criminal enterprise first, systematically eliminating the connective tissue that shields the higher-ups. This efficiency speaks volumes about his past professional focus, perhaps counterterrorism or high-value asset extraction, skills now repurposed for the darkest kind of personal contract. The detective pursuing him, let's call him Detective Miller, becomes an inadvertent mirror to John's internal struggle. Miller, we can infer, has seen too many good people corrupted or let down by the system he serves. He recognizes John's targets. They are the scum everyone knows about but cannot touch legally. Miller's frustration mounts as he tries to apply procedure to a situation where procedure has already been proven bankrupt. He might even have had a career path derailed by politics or internal corruption, making John's direct violent remedy both appalling and strangely logical to him. This internal conflict keeps the law enforcement element from becoming a simple antagonistic roadblock. It's a moral quandary played out in real-time chase sequences. The scope of the conspiracy widens as John discovers that his wife's murder wasn't just a random street crime. The larger threat usually involves someone wealthy and powerful, someone whose operations, perhaps illicit arms dealing or organized protection rackets, required silencing an inconvenient witness or simply eliminating a variable. This antagonist, the kingpin, likely operates behind layers of legitimate business fronts, a master manipulator whose primary asset is his insulation from consequence. John, by contrast, has nothing left to protect his flank. He is the ultimate vulnerability, making him paradoxically the most dangerous threat. The film builds towards the inevitable confrontation in the kingpin's fortress, a location that symbolizes his entrenched power. A high-tech penthouse or a heavily guarded private compound. John's infiltration relies less on high-tech gadgets and more on exploiting human weakness and the predictability of overconfidence. He moves through the guards not as a soldier, but as a force of nature that has finally found its target. The climax isn't about a triumphant victory, it's about achieving a necessary equilibrium, a final agonizing price extracted for the injustice suffered. The silence following the final gunshot carries the weight of everything John destroyed, including the last vestiges of the man he used to be, leaving behind only the ghost of the disciplined operative who couldn't stand by and watch injustice prevail. The narrative leans heavily on the visual contrast between John's earlier life, often depicted in warm, soft tones, suggesting domestic tranquility and simple happiness, and the cold, neon-drenched reality of his subsequent crusade. His wife, before the tragedy, served as his anchor, the embodiment of everything worth protecting, and the reason for his commitment to a normal life. Her absence isn't just a plot device, it's the excision of his soul, leaving behind a functional but fundamentally broken mechanism, John. As John transitions into the Avenger role, his actions become almost ritualistic. The way he selects his weapons or surveys a location suggests an adherence to protocols ingrained over years, possibly involving clandestine government assignments where failure meant national security breaches, now scaled down to personal accountability. If his past involved high-stakes counterinsurgency, he would instinctively assess threat levels, escape routes, and choke points even in mundane settings like a coffee shop. This ingrained professionalism makes his vigilante work frighteningly effective. He's not improvising, he's executing a deeply familiar, albeit illegal, operational script. Detective Miller's internal conflict deepens as he interviews witnesses, or rather, the terrified remnants of those who encountered John. Miller starts seeing patterns that suggest a deeper, perhaps military-grade precision in the attacks, something far beyond the typical street enforcer's capabilities. Miller likely possesses a background in federal law enforcement before being sidelined to the local precinct, giving him the expertise to recognize the subtle signatures of a highly trained operative at work. His personal stake might involve a past case where a similar legally untouchable criminal walked free, leaving Miller with a permanent scar of professional impotence. He sympathizes with the goal, if not the method, seeing John as a dark reflection of what he wished he could be when he was younger and less jaded. The network John dismantles is revealed to be far more entrenched than simple street crime. It's about influence peddling, illegal arms sales perhaps flowing through legitimate construction, or security firms owned by the main antagonist, Mr. Sterling. Sterling is the epitome of the untouchable elite, a man whose wealth affords him layers of legal immunity and private muscle. His confidence stems from generations of impunity, making him utterly unprepared for an enemy who has willingly forfeited all claims to safety and legality. Sterling views John not as a threat, but as a temporary nuisance, an expected cost of doing business, which is his fatal miscalculation. The final confrontation is less a battle and more an execution of a predetermined sequence. John doesn't rely on luck. He exploits Sterling's arrogance, the expectation that his fortress is impregnable to conventional threats. John uses environmental advantages, perhaps exploiting a blind spot in the security system that only a specialist would notice, or using Sterling's own infrastructure against him. The emotional climax is John's stark realization that while he achieved justice for his wife, he has irrevocably sacrificed his own future. The moment John stands over the defeated kingpin, there is no sense of exhilaration, only profound, exhausting finality. He has completed his final mission, but the mission has cost him everything that made life worth living, leaving him adrift in the aftermath of his righteous storm, a man forever marked by necessary brutality. The aftermath of the final confrontation leaves John in a state of suspended animation, a hollow echo of the man who once valued domestic order above all else. He does not attempt to flee or hide in the immediate sense, which is perhaps the most telling sign of his transformation. A man of his training, accustomed to exfiltration protocols and blending back into the shadows, instead lingers in the periphery of the chaos he has wrought. This quiet presence suggests he is waiting for the final consequences, not out of fear, but out of a strange sense of completion. Having burned down his entire former existence, there is nothing left to defend. Detective Miller arrives at the scene, not with triumphant handcuffs, but with a weary resignation. He finds John, perhaps wounded but standing, the very picture of efficient devastation. Miller's internal struggle reaches its peak here. Does he arrest the vigilante who brought down a powerful criminal organization that the system failed to touch? Or does he acknowledge the necessary, if unlawful, restoration of balance? The film frames this moment not as a standoff, but as a quiet acknowledgement between two men who understand the bitter reality of power structures. Miller recognizes the inherent danger John poses to societal order, yet he cannot deny the righteousness of the specific outcome. We see subtle cues suggesting John might have had prior experience dealing with clandestine government agencies or intelligence work where deniability was key. His movements, even while exhausted, retain an unnatural economy, the hallmark of someone whose body has been conditioned to conserve energy for the critical moment. This background explains his ability to navigate a sophisticated security setup so cleanly. He wasn't just a soldier, he was likely part of an elite unit where psychological resilience was tested as rigorously as physical prowess, preparing him, ironically, for the psychological devastation of personal loss. The media circus begins almost immediately, labeling John as everything from a hero to a terrorist, depending on the political slant of the reporting, a testament to the ambiguity of his actions in the public eye. For those who benefit from Sterling's corrupt influence, John is a dangerous, destabilizing force. For the common man who fears the arbitrary cruelty of the untouchables, he is a dark savior. This public reaction serves to further isolate John, reinforcing his belief that true justice operates outside the popular narrative. John's final exit from the situation is characteristically low-key. Whether Miller allows him to walk, perhaps by finding convenient evidence suggesting self-defense or a third-party shooter, or whether John simply slips away while the authorities are focused on the larger criminal fallout, the result is the same. He vanishes. He does not seek rehabilitation or peace. Instead, his departure suggests a transition to a life lived entirely in the margins, an unending penance. He has achieved the justice he sought, but in doing so, he has condemned himself to a perpetual existence without sanctuary or belonging, becoming the very kind of shadow figure he spent his life trying to protect his family from. The vanishing act is flawlessly executed, suggesting John's pre-existing expertise in deep cover and operational silence far exceeds the demands of simple evasion. This is not a man running. This is a man seamlessly integrating back into the background noise, a skill honed in environments where being seen meant failure, or worse, death. We are left to imagine that his former career involved significant assets like forged identities or established dead drops, knowledge now applied to his own solitary survival. He has become the ultimate ghost, perhaps the only person capable of hunting down figures like Sterling and then disappearing without leaving so much as a digital footprint for Miller to follow. Detective Miller, standing amidst the wreckage of Sterling's operation, exhibits a profound weariness that speaks of bureaucratic defeat. His decision, whether explicit leniency or strategic oversight, is a silent concession that the formalized system he dedicated his life to is too slow, too compromised, to handle the kind of rot exposed by John's violence. Miller's career, we surmise, was always about navigating murky ethical waters. But John presented a moral clarity born of ultimate extremity. Miller might even feel a strange sense of obligation to protect the narrative that John was neutralized, allowing the system to claim a victory over the corruption, even if it means bending the truth about the vigilante himself. He understands that prosecuting John would simply invite further scrutiny onto the very corruption Sterling represented, potentially exposing Miller's own compromises or the limitations of his precinct. The enduring emotional landscape of the film resides in the silence that follows John's departure. He achieved the objective, yet the expected catharsis never materializes. His intense focus during the hunt was a substitute for grieving. By eliminating the external enemy, he only magnified the internal void. There is no redemption arc here, only grim necessity fulfilled. The skills that once made him invaluable to a state apparatus, lethality, precision, emotional distance, have now rendered him incapable of rejoining the society he fought to protect. He has paid the ultimate price for his singular act of retribution, the erasure of his future self. The very memory of John Connor, the loving husband, is now buried under layers of necessary brutality. Any lingering association he had with the legitimate world, a bank account, a driver's license, a friend he trusted, would become a liability to those who now seek to discredit Sterling and cover up their own proximity to his network. Thus, John must exist entirely outside the grid. His continuing existence is a silent threat to any remaining associates of Sterling who might try to claim innocence. He becomes the living deterrent, a cautionary tale whispered in criminal circles about the man who came back from the dead to settle a personal debt. The narrative concludes not with an arrest or a triumphant walk into the sunset, but with the chilling realization that for men like John, whose moral compass is so rigidly defined by duty and loss, retirement is not an option. Only perpetual, solitary vigilance remains. The final lingering shot, if one were to imagine it, would not be of John walking away triumphant, but rather of him melting into the anonymous architecture of the city, a deliberate act of becoming nobody again. His mastery over blending in stems from a deep-seated understanding of human observation. He knows precisely how much detail a casual glance registers, and he ensures he registers less than static. If his specialized past involved intelligence work, perhaps training foreign operatives or deep undercover penetration, he would possess an encyclopedic knowledge of how to manipulate surveillance, not just avoiding cameras, but subtly altering the data stream or the perception of the watcher. This explains the lack of conclusive evidence Miller finds. John is too disciplined to leave behind an identifiable calling card, intentional or otherwise. Miller's decision to let John go, or at least to record his presence as inconclusive, is framed by a recognition of systemic failure. We can almost hear Miller's internal monologue. He has spent years wrestling with regulations that protect the powerful, and now, faced with the undeniable eradication of a massive criminal enterprise, he cannot in good conscience dismantle the one force capable of achieving true accountability outside the courts. Miller's adherence to the law bends not out of sympathy for vigilantism, but out of contempt for the institution that allowed Sterling to flourish. He chooses the greater, if dirtier, good, sacrificing his own moral purity for a necessary, violent purge. This act solidifies Miller's place as a tragic figure, a man dedicated to order who must tacitly endorse chaos to see justice done. John's life now is one of stark asceticism. The disciplined training that once allowed him to endure harsh environments on assignment now dictates his daily routine. He likely subsists on minimal resources, his needs reduced to the barest requirements for operational readiness. The deep emotional scars manifest not as outward breakdown, but as an intensified, almost religious adherence to self-control. Any remnant of the joy he shared with his wife is now channeled into the cold determination to ensure no other man suffers her fate, a mission that is both unending and ultimately futile, given the scale of corruption. He has traded the warmth of a single life for the cold, meaningless defense of an entire abstract concept, justice. The film closes by emphasizing this lack of resolution. John hasn't found peace. He has found a new, permanent assignment, self-imposed exile coupled with eternal readiness. He is the ultimate reactive force, waiting for the next system failure that will necessitate his ugly intervention. The tragedy is that the man who valued quiet domesticity so fiercely is now irrevocably bound to the violent world he despises. His character arc is not about overcoming darkness, but about fully integrating into it, becoming a necessary shadow in a world too corrupt for daylight heroes. He is defined by absence, the absence of his wife, the absence of his old life, and the absence of any hope for personal future. The very essence of John's continued existence is one of calculated obsolescence. He understands that prolonged exposure invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites capture or termination. Therefore, his movements are governed by a principle of maximum impact with minimum signature, a concept familiar to deep-cover operatives who must frequently burn their previous identities. His survival depends on mastering the art of being forgettable, yet simultaneously possessing the capability to become terrifyingly memorable at a moment's notice. This duality is his new burden. He must be invisible until the exact instant he chooses to strike again, a decision he presumably reserves only for truly catastrophic injustices that evade all conventional recourse. Detective Miller, now burdened with the secret of John's continued freedom, faces his own slow dissolution within the department. The success in dismantling Sterling's network brings accolades, but Miller knows the praise is tainted. He has effectively covered for a wanted man, a professional transgression that could end his career if exposed. We see this manifesting in his increased cynicism during departmental briefings, his silence speaking volumes about the compromises required to achieve true, albeit extra-legal, victory. Miller becomes John's unwitting guardian angel within the system, actively misdirecting any lingering internal affairs inquiries that might brush too close to the edges of that final bloody night. He is now complicit, bound to John by shared, unspoken knowledge. The ghost of John's marriage doesn't fade, it warps into a new form of motivation. Instead of remembering the laughter, he remembers the helplessness, transforming that vulnerability into a hyper-vigilant state. If his past involved complex tactical planning, perhaps counterintelligence scenarios where securing an asset's safe passage was paramount, he now applies that framework to his own personal survival, viewing every transient location, every casual interaction as a potential compromise in his defense perimeter. The love he held has been transmuted into a relentless, joyless duty to the concept of protective force. The narrative ultimately suggests that John Connor has become less of a man and more of an urban myth, a cautionary tale whispered among those who prey on the weak. His effectiveness stems precisely from the fact that he operates outside the known parameters of motive. He doesn't want money, power, or fame. He wants only cessation of injustice, a goal so pure in its singularity that it renders him unpredictable to criminal minds accustomed to bargaining and self-preservation. He is the ultimate anomaly, a highly skilled instrument of justice that the system itself created, then rejected, and which now operates beyond its jurisdiction. The film ends not with a resolution for John, but with his permanent residency in the moral gray zone, a necessary monster born from the failure of civilized order. The lingering ambiguity surrounding John's true origins adds a layer of mythic resonance to his character. One can easily imagine his background involving highly classified government programs, perhaps counter-proliferation efforts or black operations where the rules of engagement were deliberately vague and the cleanup absolute. This training explains his almost supernatural ability to anticipate countermeasures. He doesn't just react, he seems to operate a few steps ahead, leveraging contingencies he might have designed himself in a previous life. This suggests that his return to violence wasn't just a personal choice, but perhaps an unwanted activation of deeply embedded specialized programming that societal structure failed to suppress. Detective Miller's internal conflict evolves into a quiet martyrdom. He understands that by protecting the secret of John's escape, he is sacrificing his own clean record, and any chance for significant advancement within a department he increasingly views as intellectually and morally compromised. His interactions become terse, his dedication outwardly focused on closing the official file on Sterling, carefully framing the narrative around a massive gang war or internal liquidation, anything that avoids naming the lone operator who achieved what decades of federal oversight could not. Miller is the gatekeeper of the illusion, allowing the public to believe the system eventually worked, even if he knows the truth required a profound violation of law. John's present life is characterized by an almost ritualistic detachment from human connection. He avoids any place or person that might suggest a pattern. If he were to stop for supplies, it would be at the farthest edge of a district, utilizing cash transactions and methods designed to leave zero digital trail, the tactics of a deep-cover asset who expects immediate hostile extraction at any moment. The memories of his wife are no longer soft, painful vignettes. They have been weaponized into actionable intelligence, fueling his sustained operational tempo. He does not seek comfort. Comfort is a vulnerability he can no longer afford. The thematic weight of the film rests on this very point, the creation of an unsustainable solution. John Connor is the perfect operative for an imperfect world, an individual honed to eliminate existential threats with surgical precision. Yet, such perfection is inherently incompatible with a society that values process over outcome. His success is simultaneously his permanent condemnation. He has proven that lethal, focused, extrajudicial action works against the truly powerful, but in doing so, he has forfeited any right to live within the structure he defended. He becomes a symbol of ultimate personal accountability, a grim monument to the idea that when all official channels fail, the only remaining recourse is the disciplined application of devastating necessary force, leaving nothing behind but a vacuum where a man used to be. The enduring image of John Connor is that of a man perpetually standing on the precipice, forever oscillating between the memory of peace and the necessity of violence. His movements are now so ingrained with operational discipline that any moment of relaxation would feel like a lapse in security. If his past training involved counter-espionage, he would possess an innate radar for surveillance, constantly scanning reflections, listening for the slight, unnatural hush and ambient noise that signals observation. This ingrained paranoia isn't a side effect of trauma. It's the baseline requirement for his continued existence outside the law's purview. He has successfully made himself indigestible to the system that once might have employed him. Detective Miller's complicity hardens into a silent pact with the city's darkness. He understands that John has performed a necessary triage on a deeply diseased body politic. Miller starts exhibiting signs of professional burnout, perhaps taking extended, unexplained leaves, seeking refuge from the polished lies he must now maintain. He often rereads the files on the Sterling case, not to find holes, but to reassure himself that the official narrative is airtight, a perverse form of self-preservation. He views John's ghost as a silent partner in policing, a dark check and balance against corruption that even he, with all his badges and procedures, could never fully achieve. The emotional cost for John is perpetually deferred, never truly processed. He carries the weight of his wife's death not as grief, but as an operational mandate. Every day survived is a day dedicated to the principle that her end must not be meaningless. This dedication prevents him from succumbing to despair, yet it also locks him into a cycle where only confrontation yields a sense of purpose. He has replaced the warmth of human connection with the cold certainty of executing a tactical plan. In a strange way, the discipline forged in his former career, a career likely demanding absolute emotional severance for mission success, has made him uniquely suited to this solitary, unending war. He doesn't mourn what he lost. He simply utilizes the resulting emptiness as fuel. The film's final commentary is on the nature of American justice when it falters against entrenched power. John Connor, the civilian, was helpless. John Connor, the weaponized former operative, was terrifyingly effective. This dichotomy illustrates a profound societal failure, that only an extra-legal expert can sometimes balance the scales against the legally protected elite. His ultimate fate is to remain a self-appointed, invisible guardian, forever on call. He has achieved a terrible kind of victory, the justice he wanted. But in doing so, he has irrevocably severed himself from the world that needed protection, becoming a permanent, tragic exile whose greatest skill is now his greatest prison. The film leaves the audience with the chilling implication that John Connor is not merely hiding, but actively preparing for the next inevitable collapse of order. His former life, hinted at with such deliberate ambiguity, military black ops, perhaps advanced security consultation where the lines between protection and infiltration blurred, now serves as the blueprint for his continued, clandestine existence. He embodies the ultimate sleeper agent, activated not by a foreign threat, but by a devastating personal injustice. This preparedness means he views every moment of quiet not as rest, but as crucial low-profile maintenance, sharpening tools, memorizing new urban layouts, ensuring his caches of necessary provisions are untraceable. Detective Miller's predicament deepens as the political fallout from Sterling's demise settles. The authorities are forced to present a neat package to the public, perhaps pinning the downfall on internal corporate sabotage or a rival cartel. Miller, playing his part in this necessary falsehood, finds himself professionally isolated. The few colleagues who understood the extent of Sterling's power now view Miller with suspicion, wondering how much he knew and why the cleanup was so swift and convenient. He is rewarded with obscurity, a promotion to a less visible administrative role where his expertise is valued but his independence is curtailed. His silence regarding John is a professional sacrifice, a tacit admission that the cost of true legality sometimes outweighs the benefit of revealing a dangerous truth. The transformation of John's character is finalized when he stops reacting to the past and begins simply existing within the framework of his skills. There is no more searching for revenge, that box is checked. Now, there is only maintenance of capability. If he were to have any remaining tangible connections, perhaps a photograph or a single memento of his wife, it would not be kept for sentimental value but studied for any minute detail that could be exploited by enemies, serving as a constant, painful reminder of the vulnerability he must never entertain again. His emotional landscape is reduced to the fundamental binary of threat assessment and execution. The enduring power of the narrative lies in its critique of institutional impotence. John Connor serves as the terrifying demonstration that highly specialized individuals, when betrayed by the very structures they were trained to support, become the most effective agents of localized, brutal correction. His success against Sterling proves that high-level corruption can only be purged by equally high-level, albeit unauthorized, force. The film does not offer redemption because redemption implies a return to normalcy, and John has rendered himself permanently abnormal. He is the necessary evil that springs forth when the legal good fails, forever trapped in the shadow of his own effectiveness, ensuring that true peace remains forever outside his reach. The very air around John seems to carry the residue of danger, a subtle tension that forces strangers to give him a wider berth on the street, an unconscious acknowledgement of lethal capability. This is the residue of his previous life bleeding into his present existence. A man trained to operate in the shadows of international conflict doesn't easily shed that skin when confined to domestic territory. If his background involved advanced infiltration tactics for hostile governments, he would naturally assess every public space, a train station, a busy market, as a potential kill zone or a perfect ambush point, his mind constantly mapping ingress and egress routes regardless of immediate threat. He is living in a permanent state of tactical readiness, a hypervigilance that makes authentic human interaction impossible. Detective Miller, increasingly marginalized within his own precinct, begins to exhibit the subtle signs of moral erosion characteristic of those who have consciously chosen to protect a damaging secret. His office becomes a shrine to necessary lies. Official reports are meticulously crafted to close the case on Sterling while erasing any mention of the phantom operative who did the heavy lifting. Miller harbors a desperate, unspoken hope that John remains gone, because the very possibility of John surfacing again would unravel the carefully constructed peace Miller has bought with his own integrity. Miller now understands the profound cost of the law's inertia, and his own complicity is a heavy, invisible weight he carries into every routine procedural meeting. For John, the memory of his wife has become a cold, abstract concept, the embodiment of systemic failure rather than a source of personal pain. He doesn't allow himself the luxury of sadness. That emotion is a weakness that could compromise his operational security. His former discipline, likely honed in environments where sentimentality meant mission failure or the death of comrades, is now rigorously applied to self-containment. This might manifest in an almost monkish adherence to routine, precise timings for movements, measured caloric intake, and rigorous physical maintenance, all executed without deviation, not for health, but for unwavering operational efficiency. He has become a perfectly maintained machine, fueled by necessary rage and the absence of anything else. The film refuses to grant John the satisfaction of closure because true closure implies a return to the life he lost. By eliminating Sterling, he merely eliminated the symptom, not the disease of corruption that allowed Sterling to exist. His continued existence is a dark testament to the reality that justice, when achieved outside established means, must be self-sustaining and eternal. He is perpetually on the run, not from the police, but from the very society he sought to correct, a society that cannot acknowledge its own necessary monsters. The final impression is one of tragic necessity. John Connor is the ghost that civilized society cannot exorcise, the necessary phantom whose continued solitude proves the system's enduring flaw. The very concept of home has been surgically removed from John's psychological profile. Where once he sought sanctuary in the quiet domesticity with his wife, now the word conjures images of exposed flanks and predictable patterns, the antithesis of survival. His movements are dictated by pattern disruption. He never utilizes the same mode of transport consecutively, pays for nothing using traceable currency, and sleeps in locations that offer maximum verticality and minimal exposure to ground-level threats, suggesting a background in urban reconnaissance or perhaps aerial insertion, extraction training, where terrain awareness was paramount. He doesn't seek refuge, he seeks operational latency, moments where he can exist without being registered. Detective Miller, recognizing the futility of a conventional pursuit, begins to subtly monitor the fringes of John's previous operational sphere. He isn't hunting John. He is watching the periphery, waiting for the next inevitable echo of John's intervention. Miller starts taking highly unusual, unsanctioned measures, accessing old federal databases using outdated clearances, exchanging coded messages with retired contacts in intelligence sectors he once skirted. This descent into procedural misconduct signals his own transformation. He has become John's unofficial, compromised custodian within the system, driven by the recognition that the cleanest justice often leaves the messiest paper trail, a trail only he is willing to actively obscure. The specter of John's wife is no longer a source of active pain, but a fixed point on his internal compass, a measure of absolute failure that must never be repeated. Any fleeting memory of her, the scent of her perfume, a shared song, is instantly overridden by tactical assessment. What could have prevented this? This process has sterilized his emotional response, turning love into a cold, analytical blueprint for protection. He has achieved a state of operational nirvana where feeling is an unacceptable variable. This emotional emptiness makes him terrifyingly consistent. He cannot be reasoned with, bribed, or swayed by sentiment, because sentiment no longer exists within his operational parameters. The world John inhabits is one of stark duality: the visible, loud, corrupt society, and the silent, precise underworld where he now permanently resides. His expertise, once sworn to uphold the very law he now evades, has made him the perfect counteragent to the powerful elite. He is the ultimate systemic check, existing only because the formal systems have proven themselves incapable or unwilling to self-correct against true predatory wealth. The narrative suggests that John is not seeking to rejoin society. He has recognized that his unique skill set makes him perpetually incompatible with the soft compromises of ordinary life. He has become the consequence, the painful reality that must be acknowledged but never officially recognized, forever walking the razor's edge between necessary hero and public enemy number one. The narrative deepens the sense that John is operating under an involuntary, almost parasitic dependency on his own trauma. His skills are no longer tools he chooses to employ. They are the involuntary reflexes of a highly specialized organism that has lost its primary directive, protecting his family, and defaulted to its secondary programming, eliminating systemic threats. If his past involved counterterrorism units, his current methodology mirrors deep penetration infiltration protocols, suggesting he anticipates a confrontation not just with organized crime remnants, but with the shadowy regulatory bodies that might seek to clean up the mess Sterling left behind, bodies that would view John as an unacceptable loose end. He is hunted by two distinct factions: the criminals who fear his ghost, and the intelligence apparatus that fears his knowledge. Detective Miller's professional isolation manifests as a profound, almost religious fervor in his defense of the fabricated narrative. He develops a tic, perhaps constantly adjusting his tie or tapping his pen, a manifestation of the constant need to keep his internal world aligned with the external lie. He carries the unspoken burden of knowing that he is actively sabotaging genuine police work by concealing the most significant criminal dismantling in the city's recent history. This internal struggle manifests in his interactions with younger, ambitious officers. He views their naive adherence to procedure with a mixture of contempt and envy for their untainted capacity for belief. Miller sees John not as a criminal, but as a tragic necessity, a violent antibody that purged a tumor the system could only medicate. John's relationship with his past, specifically his wife, is revealed to be utterly clinical. He doesn't visit her grave. The location would be an unnecessary vulnerability. Instead, the essence of her memory, the vulnerability of innocence, is mentally catalogued and used to calibrate the intensity of his next action. He has achieved a terrifying level of control. The emotional core that once anchored him is now the engine of his operational efficacy. This is not apathy, it is hyper-focused conservation of self. Any external observer would see only cold execution, missing the profound, almost devotional commitment underpinning his brutality, a devotion paid to a ghost in the only currency he has left, lethal perfection. The implications of John's sustained invisibility raise questions about his ultimate objective. He is not building a network, he is dismantling existing ones. This suggests a pattern of proactive defense, implying he believes the forces that spawned Sterling, the high-level facilitators who profit from chaos, will inevitably resurface in a new configuration. John is not seeking retirement. He has found his new, involuntary vocation, perpetual counterinsurgency against unseen elites. The narrative concludes by cementing John Connor as a self-perpetuating force of nature, a man who sacrificed his soul for a single act of justice, only to discover that justice, when achieved violently, demands an eternity of vigilance to defend. He is the living embodiment of the Faustian bargain made in the name of love, perpetually trading warmth for survival and sanity for effectiveness. The 2016 film I Am Wrath, featuring John Travolta in the lead role, presents a raw, if somewhat predictable exploration of vigilante justice set against a backdrop of systemic failure. Travolta embodies Stanley Hill, a seemingly ordinary man whose life is shattered by the brutal assault and murder of his wife, seemingly escaping meaningful consequence through loopholes and inept police work. This foundational trauma serves as the catalyst, propelling Stanley from respected engineer to an agent of violent retribution. Travolta's performance, while leaning into the established tropes of the grizzled, determined Avenger, carries the weight of a career built on a diverse range of roles, from the slick charm of Saturday Night Fever to the nuanced intensity of Pulp Fiction. Here, he channels a more contained, simmering fury, reflecting the character's background as a man used to solving problems methodically, now applying that engineering mindset to dismantling a criminal enterprise. His technical proficiency, hinted at early on by his past as an engineer, becomes his weapon, suggesting a transformation born not just of rage, but of careful planning. The narrative leans heavily on the established inspiration found in classic revenge thrillers. We see echoes of Death Wish, where the ordinary citizen, disillusioned by the state's inability to protect them, takes the law into their own hands. However, I Am Wrath attempts to provide a veneer of contemporary relevance by focusing on corruption that extends beyond street crime into the political and law enforcement spheres. The antagonists, led by the smarmy crime boss, represent an entrenched power structure that views the weak as disposable. The film's structure is fundamentally episodic. Stanley systematically hunts down those involved in his wife's death, each confrontation serving as a piece of escalating brutality. These sequences are often shot with a grounded, shaky-cam realism, contrasting with the often over-the-top nature of the violence itself. The inclusion of a supporting character, a mysterious operative known only as the Preacher, complicates the narrative. This figure, who seems almost too proficient, suggests a deeper conspiracy or perhaps a ghost from Stanley's own past, though the film ultimately fails to fully flesh out this shadowy network, relying instead on Stanley's individual crusade. A significant weakness lies in the underdeveloped thematic material. While the movie posits itself as a commentary on the justice system, it offers little genuine critique beyond the surface-level observation that the police are ineffective. The film doesn't wrestle with the moral ambiguity of Stanley's actions. He is presented as unequivocally righteous. This lack of internal conflict prevents the narrative from achieving the depth found in films where the protagonist grapples with the cost of their vengeance. Instead, the film opts for cathartic release through escalating firepower and relentless pursuit. Ultimately, I Am Wrath functions as a visceral B-movie revenge fantasy. It capitalizes on Travolta's star power to sell a familiar premise, executing the required beats of the genre without offering significant innovation. It satisfies the base desire to see the wicked punished swiftly and violently, even if the path to that satisfaction feels heavily paved by genre convention and the simple, unwavering motivation of a man who has lost everything. The sheer abruptness of Stanley Hill's descent into vigilantism is what the film hinges upon, a necessary shock to jolt the audience into accepting the premise. His initial portrayal is that of quiet domesticity, a man whose identity is rooted in stability and measurable outcomes, fitting for a career engineer. This former life contrasts sharply with the chaotic, almost clumsy efforts of the police force, depicted with such generalized incompetence that it almost justifies Stanley's immediate rejection of official channels. The emotional core, however, remains centered on Samantha, Stanley's murdered wife, whose memory acts as both his guiding star and his heaviest chain. The film doesn't spend excessive time mourning, instead channeling that grief immediately into action, a direct translation of sorrow into lethal capability. Travolta plays this transition with a studied economy of expression. There are moments where the old swagger of his earlier roles attempts to surface, perhaps in the way Stanley acquires weapons or maneuvers around surveillance, but it is usually suppressed under a veneer of weary determination. It's a performance geared toward delivering payoff rather than exploring psychological erosion. We are meant to sympathize with his objective, not necessarily dissect his sanity. This emotional restriction is a conscious choice by the filmmaker, prioritizing forward momentum over introspection. The antagonists, particularly the crime boss, are rendered almost cartoonishly evil, existing solely to be dismantled. They lack the subtle shades of corruption that might complicate Stanley's mission. This simplicity allows the action sequences which favor close quarters, messy confrontations over slick choreography to take precedence. The violence isn't stylized in a way that suggests artistry. It feels utilitarian, a necessary tool in Stanley's renewed profession as an executor of justice. The enigma surrounding the preacher is perhaps the film's most frustrating element of potential depth. This character hints at a wider network, suggesting Stanley's personal tragedy might be entangled in something much larger, perhaps military-industrial secrets or deep-state machinations that the standard revenge thriller rarely touches. When the preacher intervenes, it is with a competence that surpasses Stanley's, implying a professional military or espionage background, a suggestion that subtly undermines Stanley's own self-sufficiency. However, this thread is ultimately left dangling, serving only to provide a momentary boost to Stanley's capabilities rather than enriching the overall thematic scope. The movie prefers the singular focus, one grieving man against the corrupt world, rather than one cog in a larger secret machine. The emotional weight is carried entirely by Travolta's grim resolve, sustaining the thin narrative structure through sheer force of star presence and the audience's inherent desire to see bad men justly punished without bureaucratic delay. The emotional landscape of I Am Wrath is deliberately narrow, focusing relentlessly on the singular, consuming drive of Stanley Hill. We see the engineering mind applied to destruction, precision in target selection, methodical reconnaissance, and the efficient disposal of obstacles. This analytical approach to carnage contrasts jarringly with the sheer irrationality of the initial crime that sparked it, emphasizing how the system's failure has forced a rational man into an irrational mode of operation. Stanley's grief manifests not in weeping or withdrawal, but in an almost compulsive need for control, the control he lost when his wife was taken. This manifests physically in his disciplined movements and the quiet authority he exerts over situations where law enforcement has failed entirely. Consider the characterization of the supporting cast. They are almost entirely functional. The police detective assigned to the case serves primarily as a foil, representing the bureaucratic inertia that Stanley so despises. He is not a villain, merely an obstacle of procedure, highlighting the film's central thesis that legitimacy and effectiveness are mutually exclusive in this specific scenario. His frustration mirrors a segment of the audience that understands the appeal of extra-legal action when official channels become insurmountable walls of paperwork and departmental limitations. Travolta's portrayal cleverly navigates the line between being a hero and a frighteningly capable killer. When Stanley is executing his plan, there is a chilling detachment. The moments where his humanity flickers through are often subtle, a lingering look at a photograph or a refusal to cause collateral damage that transcends mere strategic necessity. It suggests a lingering moral compass, even as he operates far outside the law. This restraint, however brief, is essential for the audience to continue investing in his quest. If he were purely nihilistic, the film would lose its sympathetic anchor. The world of the film is steeped in a pervasive grayness, both literally in its muted color palette and figuratively in its moral atmosphere. The corruption isn't sensationalized, it's treated as background noise, the air everyone breathes in the city. This ordinariness of evil makes Stanley's extraordinary response feel almost inevitable. While the action sequences themselves might rely on standard thriller choreography, the underpinning emotion, that profound sense of abandonment by society, lends them a desperate, raw edge. The film ultimately aims less at providing a nuanced social commentary and more at providing cathartic release by validating the feeling that sometimes the only appropriate response to overwhelming injustice is overwhelming personalized force. The revenge is satisfying precisely because it is immediate, targeted, and bypasses the very systems that proved themselves incapable of delivering justice in the first place. The film's reliance on Travolta's star persona is a calculated risk that pays off by lending a necessary gravitas to Stanley's otherwise thin psychological profile. For an actor whose career has seen him oscillate between flamboyant self-expression and intense dramatic brooding, this role demands a performance centered on internalized pressure cooker intensity. We never fully see the unraveling that would accompany such trauma in a more character-driven piece. Instead, we witness the result of that unraveling: hyper-focused, lethal efficiency. Stanley Hill becomes an avatar for justified rage, and Travolta ensures that every strained utterance and deliberate movement carries the weight of a life interrupted. The relationship with the preacher, despite its narrative underdevelopment, serves a vital function in terms of character dynamic. The preacher is the ghost of specialized capability, perhaps representing the military contractor world or black ops expertise Stanley never possessed as a civilian engineer. While Stanley represents the principled, albeit violent, reaction of the wronged man, the preacher embodies the practiced, almost detached application of violence. Their interactions are less about friendship and more about a temporary, pragmatic alliance between two entities operating outside conventional societal contracts. The preacher's presence slightly diminishes the ordinary man-made vigilante trope, suggesting that even to dismantle this level of entrenched corruption, one needs professional training, which Stanley conspicuously lacks but manages to acquire through brute force and ingenuity. The villains, particularly the central crime boss, are deliberately designed to be deserving of Stanley's wrath. They lack any discernible redeeming qualities, existing purely as obstacles designed to fall before the protagonist's righteous fury. This black and white morality is essential for the film's structure. Any hint of nuance in the antagonists would force Stanley into morally complex territory, something the movie actively avoids. the satisfaction derived by the viewer is directly proportional to the perceived heinousness of the crime and the immediate, unapologetic dismantling of the perpetrators. This is pure wish fulfillment cinema, where the consequences of vigilantism, legal pursuit, moral doubt, or unforeseen repercussions are summarily erased by the narrative expediency of the next action set piece. The emotional climax, therefore, is not one of moral breakthrough or tragic realization, but of completed objective. Stanley achieves a form of grim closure, not through healing or societal repair, but through the final act of balanced retribution. The enduring feeling left by I Am Wrath is one of grim vindication, fueled by Travolta's weary commitment to his role as the man who decides that if the system won't deliver justice, he will manufacture it himself. One explosion and one swift execution at a time. The film doesn't ask if Stanley should be doing this, it simply confirms that for Stanley Hill, having lost everything else, this is the only path left to reclaim a semblance of order. The film's visual language consistently reinforces this thematic dichotomy between chaos and control. The world Stanley moves through is rendered in desaturated tones, mirroring the bleakness of a society where true accountability has evaporated. When Stanley undertakes his missions, the environment often shifts subtly. While the initial setting of his tragedy is intimate and painfully recognizable, a parking garage, a public space, his retribution scenes take place in sterile, often anonymous locales, warehouses, corporate offices, or secluded hideouts. This visual segregation underscores the idea that Stanley is operating in a shadow reality, a parallel jurisdiction established solely by his own will. The engineering background subtly informs the execution of his violence. Unlike a character driven purely by adrenaline, Stanley's actions suggest calculated demolition. The placements of explosives, the utilization of environmental hazards, and the precise timing of confrontations feel less like random acts of violence and more like flawed, albeit highly effective, technical solutions to an unsolvable problem, the problem being human depravity within a corrupted framework. This methodical approach elevates the action beyond mere spectacle. It frames the violence as the application of specialized, albeit deadly, knowledge. Furthermore, the film positions Stanley as an outsider even within the vigilante sphere. His alliance with the preacher is inherently unequal. The preacher possesses the tools and the inherent understanding of the criminal underworld that Stanley must learn through painful trial and error or through timely, almost convenient intervention. This necessity for external, specialized help subtly critiques the concept of the self-made hero. It implies that even a man as determined as Stanley, armed with grief and engineering acumen, is ultimately insufficient against deeply entrenched networks unless he taps into other, equally illicit forms of expertise. The true system of power, the film suggests, is not the visible government or police force, but the unseen alliances of those who truly understand how to break things, and people, efficiently. Stanley, in his grim pursuit, is forced to become a student in this darker curriculum, desperate to graduate before his own resolve, or life, expires. The film's resolution, or lack thereof, circles back to the fundamental ambiguity it refuses to address. What happens after the ledger is balanced? Stanley achieves his immediate goal, the elimination of those responsible, but the narrative leaves the viewer hanging regarding the long-term viability of his crusade. There is no sense of Stanley returning to his former life, for that life is irrevocably gone, nor is there a clear path for him to seamlessly integrate into the preacher's shadowy existence. He is left suspended in the aftermath of his violence, an operative without a standing army, or a new mission statement. This unresolved state is perhaps the film's most honest moment, implying that once the pure focus of revenge is satisfied, the vigilante is left with nothing but the emptiness he created. The emotional echo of Samantha's absence permeates these final sequences. It is not a passionate, shouting grief, but a cold, functional emptiness that drives Stanley. This quiet emptiness is far more chilling than explosive rage, suggesting a permanent alteration of his psyche. Travolta conveys this best in brief moments of stillness following a confrontation, where the adrenaline fades, and the immense effort required to maintain this vigilante persona becomes visible in his posture and his eyes. He has traded engineering for homicide, stability for perpetual flight, all in a transaction motivated by a love so profound it demanded the ultimate destructive response. The character dynamic with the preacher hints at the potential for a sequel or a broader narrative universe where Stanley becomes a permanent fixture in the city's underworld cleanup crew. However, within the confines of this singular film, the preacher functions primarily as a narrative shortcut, a deus ex machina dressed in tactical gear, designed to rescue Stanley from predicaments that his engineering skills alone could not solve. This reliance underlines the film's ultimate concession. The battle against deep-seated corruption requires a level of specialized violence that the average good man cannot muster alone, thus slightly betraying the initial premise of the solitary avenger. The catharsis is delivered, but the logic of the world built around that catharsis remains fundamentally flawed and convenient. I Am Wrath thus settles not as a profound statement on justice, but as a successful exercise in delivering precisely the kind of blunt force emotional satisfaction its genre demands, propelled by a central performance that tries admirably to inject weight into a deliberately lightweight moral framework. The theme of earned versus inherited capability surfaces most prominently in the juxtaposition between Stanley and the preacher. Stanley, the engineer, relies on deduction, research, and application of known physical laws. His training is intellectual and structured. His competence in combat is a learned survival mechanism, raw and fueled by desperation. The preacher, conversely, operates with an almost preternatural ease, suggesting a history steeped in professional conflict, likely military or intelligence work. This difference is crucial. Stanley fights for personal closure. The preacher seems to be engaging in a continuation of his trade, perhaps finding Stanley's personal vendetta a convenient alignment of interests. This dynamic creates a subtle undercurrent of class or professional distinction even within the vigilante fraternity. Stanley is the amateur who achieves spectacular results through sheer will. The preacher is the professional who lends the operation necessary polish and expertise. The relationship between Stanley and his past life is deliberately vague concerning its emotional toll. We see the efficient dismantling of the criminals, but rarely the memory of the life before the crime, save for the catalyst itself. This narrative choice keeps the focus strictly on the action of revenge, sanitizing the long-term psychological wreckage. If the film dwelled on Stanley's inability to hold a normal conversation, to sleep, or to interact with anyone without seeing them as a potential threat or asset, it would shift into a different kind of thriller altogether, one focused on PTSD and psychological disintegration. Instead, I Am Wrath keeps Stanley emotionally locked in the moment of the crime, ensuring his motivation remains pure and uncomplicated for the audience. He is a function responding to a trauma trigger, not a man processing loss. The film's failure to meaningfully engage with the legal system beyond painting it as uniformly incompetent is a missed opportunity that highlights its desire for simple narrative payoff. A truly resonant vigilante film often forces the protagonist to confront a decent cop, or a situation where the villain possesses some shred of legal protection that Stanley must circumvent ethically or strategically. Here, the police are simply too slow, too inept, or too easily deceived. This removes any requirement for Stanley to navigate complex ethical boundaries concerning evidence tampering or official obstruction. He is simply filling a vacuum. This expediency ensures that every confrontation is a clear-cut battle between good and evil, untainted by the messiness of due process or the potential for wrongful conviction. Stanley's journey is therefore less a critique of institutional rot and more a simple affirmation that violence, when directed by personal suffering against clearly defined bad actors, provides immediate, if temporary, satisfaction. The inherent artificiality of the film's construction is perhaps most evident in the antagonist's absolute lack of self-preservation instincts once Stanley enters the equation. For a crime boss to operate at the levels suggested, with connections that reach into high places and an obvious disregard for human life, they should possess a sophisticated infrastructure dedicated to personal security and threat neutralization. Yet, as soon as Stanley Hill identifies them, these supposedly cunning criminals become ridiculously vulnerable. They are caught in easily compromised locations. They dispatch their bodyguards with predictable tactical errors, and their escape routes are inexplicably ill-planned for individuals managing large-scale illicit operations. This narrative generosity towards the villains ensures Stanley's path remains clear, but it simultaneously strips the stakes of any real-world credibility. The criminal element functions less as a complex web of opposition and more as a series of preset targets waiting to be checked off. This structural reliance on easily defeatable enemies directly impacts the emotional resonance of the final confrontation. Because the antagonists have never posed a truly intellectual or strategically superior threat to Stanley, his eventual victory feels less earned through cunning adaptation and more like the inevitable consequence of playing by simple violent rules. There is no moment where Stanley is forced to outsmart the entire system. He only needs to outshoot the disposable henchmen. This contrasts sharply with Travolta's subtle performance, which hints at a man capable of deep, strategic thought. The disconnect lies between the actor's internalized portrayal of a methodical mind and the script's insistence on rapid, uncomplicated takedowns. The engineer in Stanley should be capable of anticipating complex countermeasures, but the movie never allows the villains to present any that truly test that engineering prowess beyond basic mechanical traps or simple ambushes. Moreover, the film avoids exploring the legacy of Stanley's actions on the community he supposedly aims to protect. By focusing solely on personal retribution, I Am Wrath bypasses the difficult question: what mechanism is put in place to ensure that the vacuum left by the slain criminals is not immediately filled by someone equally or more ruthless? Stanley eliminates the symptoms, the specific murderers, but he does nothing to cure the disease of corruption that allowed them to thrive. His departure, whether literal or metaphorical, suggests that the justice he delivered is a temporary, unsustainable fix, applicable only to the singular tragic wound inflicted upon him. The film concludes its arc of personal vengeance, while intentionally leaving the systemic issues untouched, prioritizing the satisfying snap of closure over the messy reality of ongoing societal repair. Stanley Hill becomes a temporary force of nature, powerful and necessary in the short term, but ultimately incapable of enacting lasting, positive structural change. The lasting impression of I Am Wrath is one derived more from the sheer commitment of its leading man than from the innovation of its script. John Travolta, even when inhabiting a role as boilerplate as the grieving widower-turned-avenger, brings an unmistakable screen presence. His performance is a study in contained fury, the kind that doesn't require shouting but manifests in the stiffness of the neck or the unwavering focus of the gaze. This restraint suggests a man who views his violent path not as a passionate rampage, but as a necessary, albeit grim, professional deployment. A final, unavoidable engineering project where the materials are enemies and the desired outcome is finality. This internalization prevents Stanley Hill from ever descending into the caricature of the raving madman, instead keeping him tethered, however tenuously, to the concept of justified